Thesaurus of UML modeling, G. Key terms of UML modeling: abstract class, a class that cannot be directly initialized, the opposite of a concrete class. Abstraction. The essential characteristics of an entity that distinguish it from all other kind of entities and thus provide crisply defined boundaries relative to the perspective of viewer. Next. Action. An action is an operation that is associated with transition. Actions take insignificant amount of time to complete, and are considered non-interruptible. Action names are shown on the transition arrow processed by a slash and depicted in between states. Active class. An active class is a class that owns its own thread of execution and can initiate control activity, contrasted with passive classes that can only be acted upon. Active classes may execute in parallel, concurrently, with other active classes. Actor, someone or something, outside the system or business that interacts with the system or business. Aggregation, an association that models a whole-part relationship between aggregate, the whole, and its parts. Analysis, the part of the software development process whose primary purpose is to formulate a model of the problem domain. Analysis focuses on what to do, design focuses on how to do it. Analysis class, it handles primarily functional requirements, and model objects from the problem domain. Next. Analysis mechanism, an architectural mechanism used early in the design process, during the period of discovery when key classes and subsystems are being identified. Typically, analysis mechanisms are usually unrelated to the problem domain, but issued are computer science concepts. They provide specific behaviors to a domain-related class or components, or correspond to the implementation of cooperation between classes and or components. They may be implemented as a framework. Next. Examples include mechanisms to handle persistence, interprocesses communication, error or fault handling, notification and messaging, to name a few. Next. Architectural mechanism. An architectural mechanism represents a common solution to a regularly encountered problem. They may be patterns of structure of behavior, or both. Architecture, the highest level concept of a system in its environment. The architecture of software at a given point and in time is its organization or structure of significant components interacting through interfaces, those components being composed of successively smaller components and interfaces. Next. Association class. An association class is a class that is connected to an association. It is a full-fledged class and can contain attributes, operations and other associations. Association classes allow you to store information about their relationship itself. Such information is not appropriate, or does not belong, within the classes at either end of the relationship. Next. Association, a relationship that models a bidirectional semantics connection among instances. Attribute, an attribute defined by a class represents a named property of their class or its objects. An attribute has a type that defines the type of its instances. Boundary class, a class used to model communications between the system's environments and its inner workings. Next. Class, a class is a description of set of objects sharing the same responsibilities, relationships, operations, attributes and semantics. Collaboration diagram, the diagram describes a pattern of interaction among objects. It shows the objects participating in the interaction by their links to each other and messages to each other. Next. Component, a non-trivial, nearly independent, and replicable part of a system that fulfills a clear function in the context of a well-defined architecture. A component conforms to and provides the physical realization of a set of interfaces. Composition, a form of aggregation with strong ownership and coincident lifetime of the parts by the whole. Control class, a class used to model behavior specific to one, or several use cases. Next. Dependency, a semantic relationship between two things in which a change to one thing, independent thing, may affect the semantics of the other thing. Dependent thing. Deployment diagram. It shows the configuration of runtime processing nodes and the components that live on them. A deployment diagram addresses the static view of the system. Next, deployment view. An architectural view that describes one or several system configurations, the mapping of software components, task, modules, to the computing nodes, in these configurations. Derived attributes. An attribute whose value may be calculated based on the value of other attributes. Next, design. The primary purpose of the software development is to decide the system implementation. During design, strategic and tactical decisions are made to meet the required functional and quality requirements of system. Design model. It is describing realization of use cases, serves as an abstraction of the implementation model and its source code. Next, design mechanism. An architectural mechanism used during the design process, in which the details of the design are being worked out. They are associated analysis mechanism, of additional requirements. A design mechanism assumes some details of the implementation environment, but it is not tied to an implementation as mechanism. Next, for example, the analysis mechanism for inter-process communication be refined for inter-process communication, IPC, shared memory, function call like type PC, semaphore, base type PC, and so on. Each design mechanism has certain strengths and weaknesses. The choice of particular design mechanism is determined by the characteristic of the objects. Next, encapsulation. The physical localization of the features, properties, behaviors, into a single black box abstraction that hides their implementation, and associated design decisions, behind a public interface. Encapsulation is also referred to as information hiding. Next, entity class, a class used to model information that has been stored by the system, and the associated behavior. A generic class reused in many use cases, often with persistent characteristics. An entity class defines a set of entity objects, which participate in several use cases and typically survive those use cases. Next, event. An event is an occurrence that happens at some point in time. In a state chart, event is an occurrence of an stimulus that can trigger a state transition. Facade class, a microarchitecture that provides an incomplete template for applications within a specific domain. Next, generalization, a taxonomic relationship between a more general element and a more specific element. The more specific element is fully consistent with the more general element and contains additional information. An instance of the more specific element can be used where the more general element is allowed. Next, Thesaurus ER and UML modeling, at a G, is over.